So today I want to expand a little bit on breath, because when talking about pelvic floor, it is an incredibly important component of pelvic health as well as core health in creating stability. But I think we take it so for granted. We take like 23,000 breaths a day on average, and most of us don't really think about breathing at all. It's just an automatic response that our body takes care of for us, and we just do it. But in the movement world, and in some healthcare practices, breath is focused on a lot because it is very important. But it also, it's like hours and hours of explanation, and I don't really want to go totally down that rabbit hole. So I'm just going to go over some basic things. I often refer to a picture of jellyfish, which may or may not show up there in the shot. It's a picture of two jellyfish that are both, swimming mechanics of jellyfish, but they're both at like the top, because jellyfish kind of like swim like this, like they flatten out and then they make a nice dome. So in the picture, they're both a dome like this. And I compare the top jellyfish to the diaphragm and the bottom jellyfish to the pelvic floor. And in that, the picture, they're in a beautiful kind of unison, in a good flow for proper breathing. So how does that relate to our bodies? So the diaphragm, just so you understand, is located within the rib cage. So it is a band of muscle that travels from your back, connects around the ribs, and it sits kind of like up in the ribs when we're at rest, when we're not inhaling. On the inhale, what happens is the ribs, actually there's muscles between the ribs that contract to kind of bring the ribs out, kind of like blinds opening up. So they're rotating from the spine and opening up in this fashion. And as the diaphragm lowers down and flattens out, it creates this negative pressure that brings air into the lungs and allows the lungs to expand. So it creates space for the lungs to expand. And as the diaphragm comes down and flattens out, then we're going to get some pressure down through everything in the abdominal cavity. So all of the organs, and like all the viscera. And then equally, there's going to be pressure that goes down through the pelvic cavity, because everything needs to go somewhere. So also with breathing, we get chest expansion, and then we often get some belly expansion. So that accounts for some of this movement down into the abdominal cavity and some space, as well as going down into the pelvic cavity. And so when the diaphragm is contracting and lowering down to create this change in pressure, what happens is the pelvic floor has a little bit of a yield, right? So it lengthens and yields to support this load of things moving down a little bit and opening. And then on the other side, when we exhale, what happens is that's a relaxation of the diaphragm, and the pelvic floor now contracts to bring up and support the pelvic organs in that regard. And so there's other muscles that are involved in, there's tons of other muscles that are involved in this. You could go down, there's neck muscles, there's shoulder muscles. The glutes would be involved in stabilization. But the main ones with breathing are the diaphragm, the pelvic floor, the transverse abdominis, which is part of that pressure up or lifting up with the pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor contracts at the same time as the transverse abdominis, which is the deepest of your core muscles. And then on the other side, when the diaphragm is contracting down, the multifidi, which are little muscles that stabilize along the spine, they are also contracting so that they're supporting the potential load that's coming down through the abdominal cavity. So it's a beautiful relationship that, when it works, is amazing. What commonly happens is we're like sucker inners. And when we suck in the belly, it means that the diaphragm has difficulty moving down because there's a force already up into it. So it may mean not breathing as deeply. So there's a lot of people who are shallow breathers. It can transfer breath, the responsibility into the neck muscles, creating neck tension. But it also, like, a disruption here is like broken telephone. So if there's tension in through here, the natural relationship between the pelvic floor and the diaphragm gets interrupted. So the diaphragm, or the pelvic floor, is cutting down here like, I don't know what's going on, but there's a lot of pressure in through here. And I've got to, like, with a lot of pressure, when the flow isn't there, the pelvic floor is like, I've got to, like, stay tight because there's a lot of stuff coming down here and I got to keep it up. So that's a little bit on the mechanics of breath and why I often use the jellyfish as the example, because when they're in flow, when this movement is in flow, right, then it's a beautiful functional core system that allows for proper stabilization. It allows for good breath mechanics, because also if we're locked down, if the ribs aren't moving, that's not great because you don't get great rib expansion for the lungs to fill. And then again, if there's a lot of pressure in the pelvic floor, then the pelvic floor will have all sorts of issues that we hopefully can avoid. So that's a brief overview on breathing. There's 1,000 million other things that you could go into, but I think this gives a good overview as to why I put so much importance on breathing, why a lot of pelvic health professionals do. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.